Welcome back to the show. I'm so excited you're here, and we have an awesome and really special guest today. So I can't wait to get started. Before we get started, though, I just quickly wanted to say thank you so much, everyone, for listening. We already have way more people listening than I expected. And I also saw first ratings on Apple Podcasts and Spotify. So I really appreciate it. So without further ado, let's get started with today's discussion because I think it's going to be a really interesting conversation. And today's guest is another special guest, Edie Keepsfire. And Edie is a spiritual guide that I actually connected with in my neighborhood, who's always had kind words and great advice. So I'm so excited you're here. Thank you so much for taking the time. And with that, I'll turn it over to you to introduce yourself. And please also mention your pronouns for listeners.
Thank you. Thank you. I'm so honored to be here and I'm so honored for the invite. Thank you so much. So yes, Edie Keepsfire. My pronouns, I tend towards they, them. I'm not offended by he, him. And I often tell people only if you feel compelled to call me she, her. I would consider it a compliment, but it's not actually something I would necessarily ask for. So yeah, as they mentioned, I'm a spiritual practitioner. A lot of people really kind of do seek me out for guidance. I do like to sort of point people out to that my practice, I do function primarily from a lot of like legacy bloodlines. So I'm half Filipino and then half German and Welsh. And while it's taken a little bit of study to sort of like dive more into like the German and Welsh sort of legacies, I do incorporate all three of those as well as more sort of like modern practices as we should.
Thank you so much for that introduction. And I would also love to hear more about your journey throughout our conversation. And to get us started with this conversation, I would love to ask you, what does spirituality mean to you?
So to really kind of like boil it down in simplest terms, spirituality to me is the connection between the divine realm, kind of the instructions that we're supposed to get for how we should conduct ourselves on a daily basis, how we should interface with the world. So a lot of times we do talk about as above, so below. The circles that I practice in, I tend to follow the belief that all energy, all souls are an ongoing sort of like story that just get told in chapters the space of a lifetime. So I do believe that like we are here to tell this part of the story and to interact with this part of the story for the time that we're here. A lot of that really does boil down to, for me, for core beliefs, that our primary job is to heal ourselves. And when we heal ourselves, we give others permission to heal themselves. The more that begins to happen, the more we actually start to sort of heal and rebalance the world. Yeah, I'm super excited to talk about like a little bit more stuff. I'm maybe kind of holding back like a little bit to sort of like answer more things as we kind of like go along. But generally speaking, yeah, it really is like, think about, we see in certain circles and kind of like the edges of certain circles, some folks that seem to just sort of practice just spirituality and really almost don't have a connection to the day-to-day sort of like mundane world that we function in. A lot of times too many times, in fact, I've heard sort of like a problematic phrase like, oh, we should stop labeling ourselves with things like race or, gender or things like this. And my personal sort of like feel on that in terms of how I operate spiritually, I'm like, that might be a place that we want to end up in 300 years from now. But if we're still waking up to a world that is experiencing these issues where we are sort of clashing with that, then we have to embody, how do we address that? We do have to acknowledge these sort of spaces and again, these issues and how we interface with them. Again, just comes down to guidance.
Wow, there's already so much good stuff there. And I would love to talk later about the inner work that's required to heal ourselves, because that is so interesting to me as well. But I also wanted to mention the reason why I really wanted to talk to you. So the reason I really wanted to talk to you about this is that I have many queer people in my life who, just based on the last couple of years and all the craziness we've been through in the general world, who are kind of like have asked themselves those deeper questions about life. And I've been kind of always the kid that looked up in the sky and was wondering what's like beyond what we're seeing. But especially in recent years, I've started to ask myself those deeper questions again, as it happens, as we're going through challenges and challenging times. And from my conversations with friends, people around me, I'm realizing that there's lots of LGBTQ people in my life who are kind of looking for that deeper connection and are potentially interested in exploring that. But at the same time, many of them have been hurt by religion, have had really negative and traumatic experiences with religious institutions. And I was wondering if you have any advice or wisdom to share.
I am so glad. And I feel like this is, especially during the period that we're passing through in terms of history and astrology, this is one of those very important hard conversations that we need to sort of like have and bring up and face. I, myself personally, like when I was a child, I was baptized. I was sent to Sunday school, so I attended church. And I found that during those spaces, especially like sort of like during the Sunday school for kids, the grown-ups are talking about like a lot of stuff. I had questions, and honestly, I felt like they couldn't answer them. And for me, that was a bit of a turn-off for myself. I mean, there's a lot more layers of it. It's like when you really start looking more into the Abrahamic religions, there is a lot of patriarchy and a lot of stuff that we would to this day like recognize as like this is problematic. These are problematic narratives. So in terms of like that trauma, that early sort of like wounding that had pushed folks away from spirituality, what I like to tell people is that that was a connection that was never supposed to be severed. It was never supposed to be sort of like lost, but it was through the presentation of it, especially through patriarchy, through control. You know, I don't want to get too socio-political on it, but unfortunately we do have to talk a little bit about that because that, again, rubber meets the road. That's what we're looking at. A lot of the Abrahamic religions were sort of like posed to us as a matter of sort of like control. And it's like, of course, it's like when we're talking about like more sort of like queer spaces, patriarchy is completely opposed to us, our lifestyle, like how we actually live, function, who we are. And because of that, so to address the trauma part of it, it's not about interfacing with the rules of what are being said. The difference, to back it up a little bit, the difference is that typically the Abrahamic religions are a matter of you follow the rules, you do what we say. If you have questions, just shut up and have faith, but follow the rules. You know, do what we tell you. Even in those places, spiritual leaders take that sort of stance as translators, where they're like, oh, we'll talk to God for you and we'll tell you what God says. If you have a message to God, run it through me and then I'll pass it up, sort of playing a middleman sort of feel. And again, that's where the connection gets interrupted. We don't need translators for that. Each of us should be able to, based on who we are, based on the souls that are sort of piloting for like this particular lifetime, we should have a direct line to the divine realm. We should have a direct line to spirit or spirituality so that we can understand specifically what we're supposed to do. Each of us has our own specific job, specific to us, that we're supposed to do. And we need to be able to get those instructions directly from source. To kind of piggyback on that, like for a little bit more granularity even, there is a technique called Rosicrucian reading. And I know it's like, we'll look into the Rosicrucians. I myself still have a lot of question marks around them and a lot of questions in terms of like their participation in the sort of like toxicity of the spirituality. But a mechanic that they have with the Rosicrucian reading is something that I encourage people. And the idea of it basically kind of comes around as you're reading any kind of spiritual text. I've learned to translate this with texts that aren't even necessarily spiritual, but if you're looking at any kind of like spiritual text, try to put yourself in the position of the person writing it. What were they experiencing? An interesting thing that I've seen with that, especially, I'm currently going through the English translation of the original Hebrew translation of the Bible. And with that, there's a lot of times where I do the Rosicrucian reading, and I can almost see, I'm like, oh, there was something else that was behind that. Universe was telling you something, and you put down a different set of words specifically so it could lean towards what you were pointing towards. So that's one very basic sort of starter tool to sort of work with as you like look through it. I think that people might be able to connect with that in a way too, that you've seen things, even instructions, even directions, even rules that you're supposed to sort of like look at and observe. You can read that and be like, you know what, this is nonsense. I know why you put this down here. I know why you're telling me to do that. So that's part of the mechanic that we connect to when we're connecting to what would be considered more of the mechanics of Rosicrucian reading. When you think about it, like in terms of faucets, there's spirituality itself. The divine realm is kind of like the water behind a dam. And as it comes into our world, it comes through various faucets like Christianity, like Buddhism, like witchcraft, like Druidry, things like that. So I do like to sort of, that's to set up and say that this would be coming more from the workshop of divine magic. And the Rosicrucians, it was interesting. I think the Rosicrucians may have, based off of like the research that I've done, it feels like they may have been sort of the last of those who were trying to bring forth like the true spirituality from that other side of the dam before things started getting really muddled up and really kind of like infused with that sense of like control and patriarchy. Because again, that is a tool that I feel like a lot of like preachers, deacons, and churches would not really want us to connect with, because again, cuts them out as middlemen. Is that like, I don't need for you to translate that for me. I'm going to connect to spirit, and I'm going to listen to what's being said, even if those words don't necessarily match with the energy that I'm experiencing. Does that make sense?
Yeah, thank you so much for that clarification.
Beautiful. Thank you for asking.
That is really interesting. And so another question that came up for me as you were talking, you also talked about the importance of that spiritual connection to find our purpose in life and to find our unique mission. Can you tell me more about that connection?
So that ties into if folks are kind of like tuned in and listening and sort of interested in this, then I'm sure that the word synchronicity is very familiar to a lot of folks. And that's kind of the operating mechanic underneath synchronicity, is that if everybody is doing the job that you came here to do individually, specific to you, specific to your experiences, specific to who you are, where you were born, your natal chart, obviously all of that, but the experience that you had during your formative years, the experiences you had growing up through adult life, what you like, what you don't like, what you're drawn to, all of that should shape and inform a sense of, and especially if you're using that sort of like spiritual compass, it should give you a sense of, oh, if all of this is in my toolbox, including these experiences, then this is probably the thing that I'm supposed to do. Natal chart readings, of course, can give you more granularity. When you look at that and have that really truly explained to you in plain English, then it's like, well, if that's how I'm wired and these are my experiences, then it would make sense to me that this is the job that I'm supposed to do. I think in terms of when I talk about like the job that we're supposed to do, like all of that, there is, again, I function from the belief that we're all supposed to sort of like work together. And for, you know how I mentioned, we're all part of the universe creating an ongoing story through chapters of different lifetimes. Part of what I'm referencing here is talking about the the transition that we're going through, like this specific historical and astrological transition where Age of Pisces is ending and Age of Aquarius is beginning. So anybody who's like literally hearing this right now, I believe that you have shown up to help transition us into that age of Aquarius. There's been a lot of imbalance. There's been a lot of lies and obfuscation and illusion. And Age of Aquarius is, to not sound, we've heard this before, but literally Age of Aquarius is to bring about a new age of enlightenment, an age of rebalancing a lot more sort of like feminine empowerment to the point of creating more of a balance, because everything has been imbalanced. There's small models for large things. And if you're talking about how the universe sort of moves, one of the small things that's a model is nature itself. And it's like, we'll see in the systems of nature, there will become an imbalance and nature will figure out some way to bring that balance back about. And I truly believe that for those of us doing that sort of spiritual work, even those of us that are like being drawn back into it, we're helping create an equilibrium again so that we can move forward into the next, literally into the next like 300 years in a lot more of a healthier space in terms of our spirits, in terms of the world that we function in terms of the world that others are going to inherit long after we're gone.
That was so much additional good stuff. As you were talking about nature, the first thing that came to mind for me is, yeah, that makes total sense, because we've treated nature or Mother Earth not very kindly. And we are seeing like that nature's telling us to stop.
Yeah. Yeah. And it's interesting too. So like being like, the long arc tracker, and, I know that, you've, in person, like I've shown you the chart, but I'm tracking every retrograde between now and 2027, at least. I'm probably going to be in the next like year or two, projecting even further out from there based on the stuff that we've been going through. But it was interesting when lockdown happened back in like 2020, some things that I sort of pinned and was like, I'm going to keep an eye on this, is the idea that since there was much less traffic out in the world that we had ever seen, nature started to sort of like come forth. I remember one of the things that stood out was hearing reports that there were actual wolves prowling the streets of San Francisco. And to me, that was a huge sort of sense of celebration, in that humanity had sort of like quieted down enough in spaces that were previously occupied by nature, previously occupied by like the land, and that our brothers and sisters of the land, that is to say, like the animals, started kind of like reaching back into spaces where they normally would have walked. More recently, even if you check like some reports and look that up, there's in the Bay Area alone, the presence of coyotes have been happening. Like that's been coming back. And again, it's that sort of sense of nature is so much more powerful than us. Like the universe is more powerful than like who kind of like we are. So it's going to do its thing. So we can either sort of like push against it and then get washed away with the tide, or we can help sort of facilitate and bring nature back into equilibrium, into harmony, and for us to create better relation with that sort of balance. And then to sort of piggyback a little bit, I meant to say this on the previous question, in terms of like how we would interact with this, the idea of doing the specific jobs that we came down here to do. One thing that I wanted to illustrate was to think of the universe as, obviously it's like big, it's a big grand scale. This is like an obvious sort of thing, but there's more of the intersection of there's small gears that connect to large gears, like up in the universe. And those large gears, as they turn, they connect down to these smaller gears. These smaller gears then turn and then inform and infect larger gears. And there's this sort of reciprocity of movement where when we talk about like the above and below. Now, when it comes to those little small gears, that's the world that we wake up to. And when I talk about the bigness of the universe, think of it like the universe has these big stubby fingers that can't get into tiny little places. To have tiny little interactions, like, for instance, just having a conversation on the street with a stranger, being able to do these things, too big to get in there. So they send us down here in these bodies to interact with all of these small gears. So for us, it is a matter of responsibility for how are we actually affecting things down here in the below. So what small gears are we turning here that are actually affecting the larger gears that are going to in turn affect the sort of direction and movement of the world. We are passing through a period where a lot of people are like, have never reached for spirituality and that connection, and are feeling it, wanting to sort of like grow it back and connect to it. But what's the right way to do it? How should we sort of go about that? Like sort of life hacky type things that I like to talk about is that it's not necessarily like, okay, well, you have to meditate, and once you've reached this sort of space of nirvana or whatever, now you're connected and you're ready to do this kind of thing. We have these tools built in as human beings. We have imagination. One of the most powerful tools that we have as spiritual practitioners is pattern recognition sensitivity. I've had a lot of discussions with neurodivergent friends where it's like we're really kind of like doing a notes comparison, and it's like, right, the more you have a sense of like exactly how these patterns work, the more you have a sense of when there's a difference in the pattern, what to do, how to sort of respond to that. Even the idea of like hyper-focus is that you could take a little, looking at like a pattern with a little blip, you can really kind of expand that blip and go deep into it and figure out why did that blip? And then think of coming out of it and saying, okay, this is what I recognized from the blip. So being what I saw, this is how I'm supposed to respond to the world based on this little blip that I saw. But I come back to imagination because I feel like when I was a child growing up, I thought that I was only going to just sort of like be an artist when I was growing up. And with that, my sense of imagination, I kind of subconsciously put it in like the box or the work table of, oh, imagination is for doing art, for doing creative things, even expanding it to like creation with cooking, creation with interacting with people. But even that is still such a tiny little box. That too is a very important tool that we're supposed to use for spirituality. The example, again, I like to work in a lot of rubber meets the road sort of examples. So the rubber meets the road example of using imagination for that is the idea of, look at what your sun sign is. Are you a Pisces? Are you a Virgo? Are you a Sagittarius? Whatever that is. Behind that, we already know that each one has an elemental association. Sagittarius, of course, being fire, Aries being fire, Leo being fire, Pisces, Scorpio, like these are water signs. Think of what your element is, like based off of your sun sign. Think of your element and then think of how that element changes the world. Like when you think of fire is like, it's so obvious. It's like fire touches a thing, transforms it. It's never the same thing ever again. That's obvious. But how else does fire? Now you're tapping into using your imagination. Fire can create warmth. It can create light. It can create light that's a beacon that draws people towards it. It can illuminate so that people can see. Fire can do a sort of transformative thing where literally talking about food. This thing is inedible and will make you sick until you pass it through fire, and now it becomes something healthy for you. Water can carve away its stone. Water can be the base of what is medicine. Water can wash away what is dirty. Those are just examples off the top. And then I encourage everybody to think about, how does my element change the world, transmute the world? And then by proxy, how do I transmute the world? How do I change things? So that's an invite to use that imagination, and then also really give yourself credit for any pattern recognition sensitivity that you have, and try to really strengthen that.
I love the examples of the elements and how that can manifest, because I'm super into astrology, but I never thought about it that way. So that is really cool. And Hopefully we
Hilarious.
can talk more about astrology in
Hmm.
another interview.
I'd love that.
So another topic that I really wanted to cover, because I could talk about spiritual practices all day long, and I've talked, I think, or maybe I've not talked about this on the podcast before, but I do meditation, journaling, prayer, reading, and yeah, it's so individual. But I remember when I was living in DC and I had a very logical, research focused job. And I'd kind of like pushed away the spirituality, thinking, oh, I'm going to be successful in the world. And I was so focused on the external stuff. But I remember, and that at the time had a lot to do with anxiety. But I remember getting interested in meditation, going to a meditation group for when I started my practice. And that is like, I'm just, retelling this because that might be a helpful way for people to think about, oh, you don't have to do like all the things right away. And it doesn't have to be like 10 different things, but like if you're curious and you want to go to a meditation group or try a guided meditation, and even if you don't like it, that's okay too. I think being creative with spiritual practices and allowing ourselves to try different things has
Yes.
really been super important for me.
Yes, that's perfect. I'm so glad that you brought that up. I feel like that's it. It's a lot of what I recommend in terms of levels of activism really kind of translate also to participation with spirituality, and that the sort of ruler that I go by with that is do what you can, when you can, and how you can. And even with meditation, this I got to talk about because I remember when my mom was kind of like introducing me to this is what herbs we use for what, this is what crystals we use for what, these are the do's and don'ts. Like, again, when I was growing up and like her teaching me this, I remember her giving me a book on meditation and was like, this is one of the first things that you need to sort of like learn how to do. And I go through the book, I practice all of the things, and realistically, I'm like, but I don't feel like I've hit that meditative space. I'm doing all the things. I'm not feeling it. I'm this. And I was really frustrated. And also, it's like at the time, it's like mom couldn't really explain what I was supposed to get out of it. She would say the things, and I'm like, yeah, that's what it said in the book, but it's not working. I don't know what I'm supposed to do here. So the reason why I say I'm glad that you brought that up is because I now have been telling people a lot, especially folks who come into the apothecary and are asking about things. I say, think of at least the first sort of like room to access for meditation. All you're doing is quieting down your inner thoughts enough for the universe to whisper at you. Because all day long, like we're thinking about things, we're thinking about, oh, I've got to do this thing, and there was that thing, and this was actually terrible. Oh no, there was a dumpster fire, and then there was that cute person that did talk to me today. And all of that stuff is chattering. Meanwhile, the universe is standing politely off to the side, waiting for its turn. And it's not going to interrupt you because you think this is the most important thing to be talking to yourself about. But meditation is turning down the volume on all of that so that the universe can politely step in and say, may I suggest thinking about this? May I suggest turning your attention towards that? May I put this little seed of an idea in your head? So think of it like that. It doesn't have to be like a funny thing. You don't need to be necessarily feeling the energy of each of your energy points or chakras. If you're talking about the Vedic faith, you don't need to be feeling those energy points. Just practice turning down the volume enough to see what thoughts come in from the universe itself. And that can be really interesting stuff. We talk about ancestral work. There's a whole lot that we can sort of like go into in terms of spirit work. Medium work isn't really necessarily my wheelhouse at this time. But I do know some basics on that. And some of the basics, right, is when we talk about ghosts, for instance. One of the things that we've classically seen over and over is that ghosts will interact with, or spirits will interact with electricity. They're doing a thing with the radio, the lights flickering on and off, things like that. Those classic things that we've seen. The brain is just a series of electrical impulses as well. So sometimes when you're open enough, even ancestral spirits could kind of go in, get like get into one of those little synoptic responses and be like, Bink, do you remember this thing? Suddenly you're thinking about it for the rest of the day. Don't dismiss that. Really kind of like hold space for it and sort of like open up with that a little bit, which also gets a little bit more into, we had mentioned this last week prior to sort of like connecting up the idea that it's like, as queer folk, we interface with the world, we interface with life, we interface with daily decisions in a different sort of like flow, in a different algorithm kind of thing. And it's like leaning into spirituality and talking about things like that, talking about like, that's an interesting idea that popped up. I feel like it's more of like sort of like common patriarchal sort of like heteronormative sort of commonality to dismiss that and be like, well, I just have to do the thing anyway. I'm supposed to go to work, so why am I thinking about this? What a weird thought. And I feel like it is actually leaning more into queer sensibilities to be like, what is this thing? Hold on a second, y'all. What is this? Can I open this up? Can I examine this? Can I see where this came? Where did this come from? And really kind of taking a little bit more time and being present with it. Again, I'm not saying that's completely a sort of like queer sort of like trait, but I feel like just by way of like how we live, that's something that we have a little bit more of easy access to, and something to really kind of lean into through one's own spiritual journey, is being present with yourself, being present with the moment, being present with any little question marks that pop up that are like, oh, is this a thing that's happening? Or am I just actually having a really random thought? And more often than not, especially with synchronicity, like the idea of synchronicity being present, it probably isn't just a random thought. It probably is something that, for whatever reason, you needed to see.
Thank you so much. So, because I've talked to a few people about this, so people with like anxiety or trauma background, some people I've talked to have also mentioned that meditation can be really hard for them because triggering stuff may come up. But I've also heard people say they maybe they don't sit on the meditation pillow, but they see art as meditation or journaling. How do you feel about that?
I'm smiling super big right now because I'm like, yes, it's like, I feel like, again, coming from the traditions, and I'll touch on this first and then I'll talk more about like interfacing with what meditation means to a person. Coming from the traditions, it's like there is, again, sniff out that sense of like patriarchy and control and rules. Because again, a lot of the Abrahamic religion is just follow the rules, do what you're told. Whereas a lot of what I talk about in terms of the connecting to the job that you're supposed to do, that's the complete opposite. It's more of like, okay, breaking of the rules, because the thing is, 100 people might tell you, do it this way, not that way. 1,000, 10,000 people might say, never do it this way, always do it that way. And the universe might be speaking to you and be like, yeah, I know I got 10,000 people who do it this way, but I need for you to do it specifically this other way. I've encountered that in my own practice. I've encountered that with the practice of others. Even strangers have said, look, I know that this is how everybody does it, but I got the download. I was told to do it this way, so I'm going to do it this way. In those moments, I'm like, me too. I've seen that too. So when we talk about like the meditation stuff, yeah, it's like you don't have to have the meditation pillow. You don't necessarily need to have like the sound bowl. You don't necessarily need to have the incense. A lot of these things can help. It can. But what really helps is what you connect to. You mentioned looking at art. If looking at art quiets down the noise from absolutely everything else, if you suddenly aren't paying attention to the anxiety and you're having good, clean breaths and opening yourself up, well, then that's the place that you start with meditation. I even go as far as to say mundane tasks can be, and honestly probably should be, a meditative sort of space. And again, this is like how we tap the imagination part. I'm like, that's where that comes from. Meditation isn't, you have to do this, you have to sit cross-legged, you have to make your hands like this, you have to quiet your mind, do all of that. No, what works for you? Is this a meditative experience that's allowing you to connect to something larger than yourself? Use your imagination around that. I often tell people sometimes doing dishes is a meditative thing. And I know people will be like, well, it's relaxing, sure. No. You can use that as a meditative experience. It's a matter of like what parameters are you sort of like working under. You can have a quiet moment. You can just be quiet and enjoy washing the dishes, or you can add that extra layer of, as I'm doing this needs to be a spiritual experience for me. Even the sense of I am with this body, placing my hands on things that have gotten dirty or mucked up, and I am physically making them clean. I'm physically transforming them from a more toxic state to a less toxic state. Like think about that kind of thing. Even with that, a friend of mine who carries really strong, like beautiful movement and healing medicine. I sent her this meme one time that I saw, which is it's like Osiris or Amun-Ra with a vacuum cleaner, like clearly in a living room somewhere. And the caption is, when you're trying to be about that spiritual life, but you got to do chores. And I'm like, oh, this is fun. My friend will get
I
this.
love it.
So I sent that to them, and they responded immediately, like without a beat. They said there is no esoteric life without chores. And that hit so hard in my soul. I was like, that is real. That's actually the gospel. Like the second sort of like corroboration with that is when I was in Wyoming learning indigenous technology through permaculture. I had known this person since I was maybe about 16 or 17. During lockdown, she invited me to come out to Wyoming. She would teach me the basics of indigenous technology through permaculture, as long as I helped her sort of like set her homesteading site up for that. So we were doing a lot of that kind of work. I'm in the dining room having lunch, and I couldn't exactly hear what she was saying to her son. I couldn't exactly hear the conversation, but then I heard the son's tone, sort of disgruntled, mumble, 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 mumble. And she got loud. It filled up the entire kitchen. And she said, yeah, well, you know what? Sometimes that's what it is. Sometimes witchcraft is boring and it's tedious and it's chores and we don't want to do it. And that's part of witchcraft too. You wanted to learn, you're going to learn. I was like, that too. There is no esoteric life without chores. So weave that in. And especially I encourage that because I feel like some of the inaccessibility with like spirituality is like, well, I don't have all the tools. I don't have all the right crystals. I don't even have an altar sort of space. Morihei Shiba, the founder of Aikido, in his book that explains the spiritual and sort of like philosophical principles of Aikido, he has a passage where he says, one does not need money, power, or churches to practice the art of peace. Heaven is right where you stand, and that is the place to train. And that's really, I keep that in mind for all of that kind of stuff. Full moon ritual doesn't have to mean that you've done a full herbal bath and a full herbal cleanse and you've lit your candles and incense and you have everything all set up in the right place. There's some basic things to have in place. I say call corners. That way you have like a safe energetic space to work with. More important than even meditation is just grounding. That way you are receiving energy that you need. You're sending out energy that you don't. You have those two things in place. It doesn't have to be a full-on ritual. You don't necessarily even have to have things written down that you're intoning. You could be in between a closing shift and then an opening shift the next morning with really no downtime. Set an alarm, take 20 minutes, sit down with a cup of herbal tea during the full moon, think about where you've been for the past month, think about where you want to be a month from now. Give yourself recognition for all of your accomplishments, not just in the past month, but your entire life. Think about all of the dreams that you have. 20-minute timer goes off. Guess what? You've just done full moon ritual. It can be as simple as that. Of course, it's like when you feel like you have the spoons and the capacity and the resource to do more, then do more. But at bare minimum, wash your dishes and consider it a meditation. Have a cup of tea and consider that full moon or new moon ritual. It's as simple as that. I had a client recently who, just after Lionsgate, we're doing the session, and she says, well, what did you do for Lionsgate? And I said, well, I updated the forms that I use for like astrology for clients. I did some cleaning. She said, but it was Lionsgate. And my response was, but I live in these sort of places anyway. So everything that I'm doing is infused with attention to spirituality, which kind of goes back to, again, what does it mean to me? How am I interacting with the world as a spiritual person? You know?
And it's amazing what you said about like tying it into chores, because what I love about that is I think when we talk about spiritual practices, it's easy to assume, oh, like I have to go on an expensive retreat or I have to go to a monastery to meditate. But really it brings it down to reality of like, okay, there's still stuff we got to do in our daily lives. And I love that tie-in. You touched on the ancestry piece when talking about meditation. And I know that's something we talked about that I thought was so fascinating in terms of connecting with our queer ancestors. Can you talk more about that?
Yes, thank you so much for bringing that up. I've studied and researched and really kind of like done the litmus testing on a lot of spiritual practices because I'm mixed bloodline, because of who I am. I've had to look at a lot of this kind of stuff. And a thing that I have seen when we're talking about ancestors, there's a few rules, and not rules, but like a few guidelines that we can kind of like work with on that. Is one, when we talk about like bloodline ancestors, you don't have to invite in every bloodline ancestor, you know? Like if there was a person who you knew in life who was really abusive and was a real piece of work, that there was something wrong there, you don't have to ever invite them in. You could even say, that is an ancestor I do not connect to, I do not work with. Again, in terms of bloodline ancestors, the ones that you knew always looked out for you, always took care of you, and always watched over you, you can open a channel and align to them. I talk about that on the sort of like, that's the sort of like base level. What we see in a lot of other practices, especially even like once I had looked into, for instance, African American root work, there is a sort of rule that it's like, okay, look, you may not have had necessarily a bloodline connection to Harriet Tubman, but if you are trying to do some kind of work where you need to get from point A to point B safely without being seen, without being harmed, without anything like that, then call upon Harriet Tubman as an ancestral spirit. If, you know, like that's the sphere of sort of like the sphere that you're working within, you know, and with this, it's like, it's a little bit more of like an ethnic sort of like, this is that sort of sphere. Now we kind of translate that into, we've seen this in a lot of different ways. And what had come up even more recently, this was not even my my download. This wasn't even my ideation. At the time, I was dating a trans woman who very much was connecting a lot more to her own sort of like druidic like sort of practices. And under one particular Samhain, she grounded, she connected, she opened herself up. She created a Google Doc and sent it to me and said, listen, this is a thing. This is my contribution to the spiritual work that's happening right now. I read it. It's available. She said, share this with all of the queer folk that you know. But when she went over it and she talked to me about it, it was the matter of ancestry, and especially ancestry through the sort of like sphere of being queer. Like she went on to say, our ancestors come from Stonewall. Our ancestors come further back. She was like, any queer folk that have ever existed through history are ancestors that through our spiritual work, we should connect to. We should call upon their strength, their support. We should offer gratitude for any of the service that they've done before. She goes on in the document to say, I too one day will pass into the ancestral realm, and I expect people to call upon me for support. And with that, again, through the discussions of it, her idea was we all should be living a life and connecting to spirituality in such a way, living that life with such momentum that when we die, when we pass into the ancestral realm, that even if future generations of queer folk don't know our names or don't know who we are, they could still reach out to the energy of who we are and know that we are ancestral spirits. And from our side, knowing to look out for that call and be like, oh, you need some support. This is how I lived. This is how I exist now. This is how I can show up as an ancestral spirit and support you, even and kind of, especially if we're not bloodline, like knowing what those struggles are, knowing what chapters I went through in my story, and recognizing that for you who are still alive, what chapters you're moving through and how I can support that.
That is so beautiful. That's so impactful. And it reminds me, so on our last episode, we discussed chosen family, and it just made me think, wow, like chosen family, it has played such a huge part in my story, but that really expands my view of chosen family, which is amazing.
Right.
Another thing that I wanted to talk about that you mentioned as we were preparing for the call was getting a lot of traditions, spirit guides and healers and people working in this space, that they're traditionally non-binary and transgender. And it made me think of another conversation we had on the podcast about the book The Hero Within. That book, have you read the book?
No, but I'm going to.
It's really cool, and I have like two podcast episodes about it too. But the author Carol S. Person says that the magician, one of the archetypes, is inherently androgynous because when we assume this archetype, we have to balance male and female energies. And so I was hoping that you could talk more about that.
That is exactly literally the sort of wheelhouse to work from with that. Again, just touching on ending of Age of Pisces and stepping into Age of Aquarius, bringing back more of that sort of balance. For me, I felt like it was validating the first time I ever heard from like the Native American narrative. No, two spirit people exist. And me, I'm standing on the mountaintop, like yelling and pointing at that and being like, right, see, look at the validity there. Then I would come to find out, even through my own sort of like bloodline research and legacy practice and legacy study, in the Filipino culture, a lot of the medicine people would either, and it's like, I remember the quote saying they either were mostly women or they were men that embodied feminine qualities. And it's like reading this line over and over again and then reading through that and being like, right, it's like these were men who actually would wear more of like the traditional garb of like women as they practice this. And I'm like, okay, there's this. Of course, like all of my synopses are firing because I'm like, right, in order to do this, there needs to be a balance of masculinity and femininity. And it's like, whether we're talking about like non-binary, we're talking about trans, or we're talking about even like what type of like sort of like your queer persona like is going to be like, well, I tend to be a little bit more masc, I tend to be a little bit more femme, like all of those kind of things. There still is an understanding of both sides. Understanding of both sides classically in any kind of spirituality or faith or anything, we are always looking at like this balance of harmony. Like bring it all the way down to like the yin and yang, It's like these are two supposedly opposing forces that work together in harmony. Now with that, it's not just the Native American narrative. It's not just the Filipino narrative. You can throw a stone in the internet and you could find these. And oftentimes what I encourage people, I'm a big advocate of find out what your bloodlines are and then try to search it down. I know that like a lot of times, the first wall that you hit is, oh, in terms of your ethnic background, this is when the Catholic Church was established, or this is when Christianity was established. Look deeper. There's more. There was something that was happening before that, even if it wasn't necessarily called that country. What was happening on that indigenous land in terms of spirituality prior to that might take some digging, but I promise once you find that keyhole, once you start asking questions, you'll start finding out and you'll start seeing all of those kind of things. With that, I have seen it track all the way down to ancient Egypt, where they have talked about the essence of people who hold both masculine and feminine energy, who both work with them to the point of being reported as androgynous, being reported as like embodying, even sometimes, and especially when we're talking about like the Egyptian stuff, there have been some reported figures who physically looked both male and female. So really held both of those. And again, it is a matter of like understanding that. Even when I talk to people about like practice, we talk about like a lot of us, of course, we like to wear crystals, like in terms of like jewelry, in terms of rings, in terms of bracelets. What I always point people out to, especially with the idea of that, is that there are a lot of classic lines of energy that would consider, in terms of the body, they would consider the right side as being more sun energy, more masculine energy, more reaching out into the world. They would consider the left side more moon energy, more femme energy, more drawing in from the world. And I'm like, work with both. Like, like even like seeing me at the shop, it's like I have one hand that's, it's stubby, it has no nails. And then I have the other hand where I do have like my sort of like nails done. Part of it is just, it's like, I like nails, but like when I was first learning to navigate, I'm like, I need one hand that can do things. And I was like, you know what? Let it be the sun hand. Let it be the more mask hand. Let me actually have a physical symbol representation of the two sides of that. And when talking about like wearing jewelry, wearing crystals, what energy are you reaching out into the world with? What energy are you drawing in from the world? Sometimes I actually do, and today actually is one of the days where I did swap. Normally I have all of these rings on the right hand, all of these rings on the left hand, and today was one of those days where I was like, no, I actually want to reach out with this energy, and I actually want to draw this energy in based off of, again, what feels right in the moment. What are you supposed to be doing today? How is your greater sense of spirituality saying, this is how to interface with the world that you're going to wake up with and, go into and interact with?
Thanks so much. This was amazing. And before I could talk about all of this for like hours,
Me too.
but I want to be respectful of your time. And before we wrap up today, I would love to ask you a few questions that I ask all of
Mhm.
my guests.
Yes.
So the first question is, tell me about a time the kindness of a stranger has made a difference in your life.
For me, the way that I've lived, I feel like there is an abundance of those. And it's, where do I pick out which one necessarily? What I would kind of like hone in and focus on, I was trying to think of like a specific sort of like, oh, there was this time where this happened, but I'm so serious. They've been so abundant. I think of all of these little sort of times where it's a complete stranger. We've interacted for less than a minute or a minute and a half. And that bit of kindness hit me and changed things. Part of with that I'll talk about, I'm not just necessarily dodging the question, but part of what would be explained to me later with that, the Magi that I work with, he says to function as an awakened creature. And when you are awake to the world and you are functioning in that way and you're ready to engage in the world as an awakened person at any given moment, sometimes it is just enough to behold an awakened person. And he tells me, he says, those times where you've been walking down the street and you smile at somebody at a bus stop and they smile at you and it feels like everything is always going to be okay forever from now on, and you didn't even say anything. He says that you passed an awakened person and they gave you a little bit of that connection to help sort of like steer you more onto the path that you're supposed to be on. There is that. I have seen, there was a time that I was trying to make rent and a person was like, you know what, I'm going to commission you for this thing and it's going to cost, I'm going to pay you basically 3/4 of what your rent is just for the commission. And that was out of nowhere. It was the kindness of their heart. There's so much of that I've encountered. And I did preface it by talking about that because that's the place that I function from. There is this sense of reciprocity. I know that a lot of spiritual practitioners will say, oh, like the rule of three, that's more of like a Wiccan thing. It appears in so many different things where it's not specifically the rule of three, but the sort of general guideline with that is what you put out into the world comes back to you, and it comes back to you in great abundance. So that's why it's like any kindness that you ever receive from like a stranger, be looking for those opportunities where you can do that as well. And it's not a transaction. It's not an exchange. What you're doing is just creating better and better goodness and more brightness and more life and more kindness and connection and compassion in the world. You're introducing more of it kind of per capita. You know, the more that everybody is doing that, it's just creating a better world. Because even if you're super not connected to people, and you get a little bit of kindness, you're going to want to sort of like share that kindness out. Whereas if you didn't get that sort of kindness, maybe you're just going to keep trucking along in that lane where you're like, I don't really connect to people and I don't really like people. But even a little drop of that now rattles around in your own soul and is like, you know what? Maybe I want to do something a little bit nice for somebody. Maybe I'll even just have a kind word for somebody. Maybe I'll even just have a kind gesture where I don't really interact with them beyond that. So with that, I'm like, build yourself like a multitude of kindness from strangers, and be the stranger who's creating a multitude of kindness for other people that you may never even meet.
That's amazing. That is beautiful. And so my last question, can you tell me about a time that you've experienced a synchronicity in your life?
I love this part. More and more, I'm realizing that what may seem random, and this is part of the layers that I work with in terms of like spirituality and also mysticism, do tie into sort of like quantum theory. It's less random, and almost everything is synchronicity. And it might be a matter of something seems random, and you might be like, okay, it's been 3 days and that still doesn't make any sense. It's been a week and that still doesn't make any sense. You may have to go a decade before you realize, oh, that's why that thing had to come into place. That's why I had to see that. That's why that had to come into play. A very specific example is fun. Grace, who lives in the castle.
It's my neighbor.
A neighbor of ours. It had to do with her. So what happens is that a friend of mine texts me. She's really powerful with like the sight, and really kind of like she'll get accidental blips where she's like, oh, I need to check in on this person. Or she'll be like, I was doing something and I totally saw this happening in your apartment and I knew that I had to call you, kind of thing. So she calls me one morning and she's like, hey, you need a ride to work. And I'm like, I was just going to leave super early and take the bus and BART and then bus and get there. I said, but I would love to do a ride. Plus we could sort of like talk. We're talking and she's going through a lot of stuff where she's bringing this up and she's like, how do I interface with this? What do I do with this? Here's all of this. And I'm kind of talking through her, you know, like line by line. I'm like, well, with that kind of thing, you want to pay attention to this. With this kind of thing, you want to try to remember that. With this kind of thing, you want to ask yourself about this. I'm going through all of this stuff, and really she's coming with the questions. I'm offering, you know, directions to go in with that kind of thing. Very specific, all very specific there were very specific items happening, very specific things that she was bringing up, even like with her father, like things like this, right? We go from my home to the workplace, not even at the workplace. I say, I got to stop at the 7-Eleven, get a little bit of caffeine, get a little bit of stuff so that I'm geared up for my, you know, full day. And I tell her, I said, I'm not quite ready to go in yet, so let's just kind of like hang out here on the block and talk like a little bit. We're talking, and then Grace comes around the corner and sees us, and my friend, she has her staff with her, and then of course I always have my staff. And Grace pops around. Grace knows me. We've talked before, and she's like, "You guys gotta nice couple of stabs. You got good stabs there. And then suddenly Grace is in the conversation, and it's almost like she's being propelled forth. She starts talking, and she's saying the exact same stuff to my friend that I just told my friend in this 20-minute car ride. And I'm looking over at her, super smug, and nodding and gesturing at Grace, as confirmation. And she's just going along, point by point by point by point. And my friend is just absorbing this. And I'm getting to the point where it's like, Grace is like, and you always got to remember this, and you should always pay attention to this, and you should always ask yourself this. She literally is doing this verbatim. And I'm getting to the point where I'm like, see, what did I just say? That's what I was saying. That's what I was saying. She finishes this off. Grace is like, how she is. She's like, okay, well, you guys be safe. She's sort of like exiting the conversation. And as she's exiting the conversation, she's sort of walking, and she is side by side with my friend, and she turns to my friend and she says, now, was that synchronicity or was that coincidence? And my friend thought for a second, like not thought, but like held that space for a minute. And she said that was synchronicity. And Grace, for the mic drop, said, it's only coincidence if you're not paying attention, and was gone. And just kept walking. And I'm like, and that's Grace. That's Grace.
That is amazing. And it
Right.
sounds like Grace, yeah.
Wow. So that's one of my favorite stories about like synchronicity. Again, because it was so exact, so precise. It was the exact conversation that I had just had with my friend, and Grace had no idea. She just walked into it. Well, I mean, she had every idea because she walked into it.
Thank you so much for the amazing conversation. There's so many things that I'll be sitting with, and I'll probably have lots more questions for you, but I really appreciate you taking the time to come on. For listeners who want to connect with you, where can they find you?
I can actually, if this will be posted online, I can give you a little link to sort of like my landing site, and or I would say pop up at the shop that I work at and just ask for Edie Keepsfire. So I am over at Twisted Thistle Apothecary over in Piedmont. That's my home store. I'm pretty much scheduled every weekend and every Wednesday. So if you come in on a weekend or a Wednesday, I guarantee you'll be able to catch me, unless I need that day off, unless I've called off. But that's my regular schedule there. But again, I can also float some information, and super grateful and really appreciate you bringing that up and offering that. And also, again, have a lot of gratitude just for being here, just for being invited, just to be connected with you, and then also to be connected in these spaces. So thank you so much.
Thank you. And I really hope to can have another chat soon.
We can talk more whenever you just reach out. We could talk about stuff. Like you said, both of us, we could probably talk about this stuff for hours and days on end. So we can continue talking about stuff whenever you like.
Great. Thank you so much.